We've come now to the end of the first iteration of China X. It's a course, as you will have seen, that would not have been possible without the help of an extraordinary team here at Harvard, but also collaborators and friends from all over the world, in China in particular, but from different parts of this country, and of course from many parts of Harvard University. For us, it's been an extraordinary experiment of a new way of teaching. It has changed the way we teach inside our classroom here at Harvard.
You know, when you've traveled around the world a bit, and I have, everywhere we've gone, we've met people who introduce themselves because they have been watching China X. It's really an extraordinary thing.
Just last month, I gave a talk at Renda, at Renmin University, a great university, and there was a gentleman in the audience who not only had been watching China X, but he knew the Dynasty song.
Wow.
And I had him sing it.
Oh.
So
I was in Australia and met people who had been doing China X as well. And so it's been wonderful meeting you. And we want you to send your reflections to us. How long have you been with the course? Did you begin in the beginning or only later? Did you go back? What did you find most interesting, most challenging? We'll be sending you an email and asking you these questions again and telling you how you can send us your reflections. But Bill, you know, we began 15 months ago, a long time ago, with the big picture. We talked about time, space, identity.
right.
Back to the Neolithic and before, geography of China, all the way to the present with Xi Jinping. And we looked at this great empire that China created, the Han and the Tang and the Sung, but also this notion of China having an antiquity which in some sense was better than the present, that no empire could live up to it. And yet China created empires that were far larger than what had existed in antiquity. And I think particularly on the last 1,000 years, where you see the Yuan, the Ming, and the Qing. It strikes me, though, that the Yuan and the Qing were the two greatest empires.
In size, for sure, and the Qing arguably in many other ways.
Right. And yet they, some people would say, weren't quite Chinese.
Well, you just said earlier that China created these empires, but that's actually not quite correct, in the sense that the concept of what is China is it's a very modern question,
Right.
understood or taken for granted sometimes in earlier eras, but in fact the two physically largest empires in all of the realm of Chinese history are those created by outsiders, by Mongols, by Manchus.
By the Yuan of the Mongols and the Qing of the Manchus.
Self-consciously multinational, multi-ethnic structures, obviously in which Chinese civilization plays a core role, but it is not the only thing that holds it together, or certainly and not the main thing that brings it together at first.
You know, it seems to me that one of the important things about thinking about history is that it gives us a chance to reflect on the past and to see that multiple positions are possible, and multiple kinds of relationships between peoples, from hostile to conquest to compromise to getting along, cultural exchange, things moving about. And that one of the great things about learning from the past is that it gives us a mirror on our present. And we see that our present isn't our only option. And I think that's worth thinking about in China today, as we see some of the tensions that are taking place on the western borders.
But it actually is important to know history, to know your own history, to know the history of others,
Right.
From whom you can learn, but to know yourself. It's a particularly great challenge in 20th century China, to the degree to which long-standing narratives of Chinese history were abandoned or suppressed.
They were abandoned and suppressed, but in some ways they've been able to come back. I think about the ways that when I began to study China in the 1960s, when you began to study China, and the way in which the value of the Chinese past was denied, and yet today, and we saw this already under Jiang Zemin, but also Xi Jinping, and there was an element of this in Mao Zedong as well, a sense of a culture and a tradition, a civilization that was inherently worthy. And, you know, we were talking before about what made it possible for China to lead in the past. It had power.
Right.
It was wealthy. It was the biggest market in Asia. It extended its borders through trade, but also through war.
Yes.
It had technology, but it also was something more than that. It was more than power and wealth, it seems to me. It represented a notion of civilization.
Right, a notion that was so powerful that it would be adopted, even though not recognized simply as Chinese, but as civilization.
Civilization itself.
By Korea,
right.
to a considerable degree in Japan,
Right.
in Southeast Asia,
Right.
Chinese forms of governance, Chinese values, or values that we say, we won't call them Chinese values, values that emanated from the place that is today China. These are the values of East Asian civilization, and they are powerful across national and imperial borders.
And so in some sense it was the combination of a large population, organization, political organization, the ability to have wealth and power to generate it, that went together with ideas, a conviction of the value of civilization, a belief in what the Confucians called renni, benevolence or humaneness and righteousness, that these were universal values and should be shared.
And it also allowed later empires, Ming and Qing, for example, to govern enormous swaths of territory with very few officials because of a sense of shared values, values that could allow a great empire to be governed on the cheap because people knew what was expected of them in their time and place. Not perfectly, by any means, but this sense of a shared value of what it meant to be civilized.
You're the modern historian, and over the years we've thought very often about ways in which modern China really is different. And clearly it's not, the dynastic forms, emperorship, the civil service examination, today, they're not what they were in the past. But I think another part of it's on the sort of what might be called the soft power part. China in the modern era has really come to accept the notion that there are ideas outside of China.
And indeed, China's recovery from the Western invasions of the 19th century, rapid recovery, in fact, from the era of high imperialism, from the fall of the Qing, was facilitated by and necessitated the use of international models of governance, of international models of revolution that were not historically Chinese, but in fact were borrowed liberally from the West. Marxism, Leninism, Stalinism, communism. These are powerful tools of both revolution and state building that have defined modern China as much as anything else that I can think of. They've been affected by Chinese in a Chinese setting, but they are not historically Chinese ideas. And it is, and indeed, in the 1950s and 60s, China and the Soviet Union would have a fierce ideological battle, not over China versus the West, the kind of rhetoric one hears today, but over which brand of communism, which brand of Marxism was the real brand.
And yet it seems to me that one of the aspects of, particularly today, I guess we're more aware of that. As this has been going on, there's also a great deal of uncertainty or ambivalence in China about the fact, this connection to, the dependence on ideas coming from outside.
There is indeed. As we've said, the Minister of Education recently denounced the proliferation of Western ideas as opposed to Chinese ideas in universities, that they should not be privileged above Chinese ideas, without ever defining what is a Chinese idea and what is a Western idea. In an era of internationalization, it's not that easy to do, and certainly not easy to do when Marxism-Leninism remains the official ideology of the People's Republic of China. So he's in a bit of a quandary himself, has been challenged to identify these different strands and has yet to respond in a clear way. As a historian of ideas, what are the ideas that made Chinese civilization, that made civilization from this part of the world so powerful for so long? And what resonance do you see today?
Well, I think that there are a number of things that go on. First is the very concept of civilization itself, that you can have a better way of living, that humans can create for themselves something that is a moral society, an integrated society, degrees of social equality, of moral leadership, the idea of culture, that learning and writing were ways of communicating and spreading shared values. The idea of humaneness and righteousness, right? Of social procedures and customs the idea of ritual,
Right.
going back to Confucius and his discussion of that. But I think there's something else to this as well. You know, my own work is in intellectual history, is looking at Chinese ideas and teaching, of course, about Chinese ideas in a Western context, an American context. But do you know what one of the most popular courses this past year has been here at Harvard?
I do.
Why don't you tell
Professor
people about it?
Pewett's course on early Chinese thought.
Now, you met Professor Pewett early on when we were talking about the 100 schools and Confucius. And it's an extraordinary thing, right? That here we are at Harvard and 600-700 students take a course on early Chinese thought.
Now, to be sure, every Chinese university student will take a course on Marxism, but it isn't quite the same thing because it's required. And this is these are all volunteers.
Yes, you know, I think there in American politics, there's a certain brand of American politics that thinks it's not appropriate for American students to learn about the ideas of Europe or certainly not the ideas of China.
We have our conservatives too.
We do, but I don't think we'd ever let a politician tell us that we couldn't teach Chinese ideas to an American audience.
No, wouldn't happen. Certainly not in any great university in this country. Where do great ideas come from? If you think of the people whom we read still today, Confucius, Mencius, Xunzi, and so on, the greatest ideas that have dominated political discourse in China don't actually come from the government.
They don't come from emperors.
They don't come from the leaders.
If we think about, to begin with, Confucius, who's really in many ways a marginal man, right? Who sees himself as having political responsibility far beyond what his social status allows, who sees learning and antiquity as sources of authority. We could go on through the rest of history, and I can't think of a single important intellectual who's also an emperor.
Right.
It is really a kind of, from the Chinese civilization, or the ideals that guide the civilization, rise from the bottom up.
Right. If we were to look at the history of the 20th century 2 or 3 centuries from now, I think one would look back on the leaders, Lei Qing, Republican, PRC, and again, the same thing would be true. I'm afraid
and
so.
I think very often that people who create ideas that the next generation will follow are marginalized in their own time, rejected, exiled. Think of in the beginning of the end of the 19th century, early 20th century,
Yes.
Yang Qichao, Kang Youwei, and others.
Indeed,
right?
indeed. And this is why, in some sense, when one talks about the aspirations that President Xi has for a Chinese dream, which are, of course, shared by so many, the great revival of the Chinese nation, and yet the people propagating it on his behalf are out of organs of state propaganda and so on. And those who seek to think more independently, the marginal people in the political system of today, those are not yet heard, at least not heard within the PRC itself. And that is perhaps, I don't know, where some of the great ideas of the future of Chinese civilization will come.
We can tell you now something about China X 2.0. We actually plan to go to China and meet a lot of those people and talk to them and bring that back to the next version of China X.
I look forward to that.
They are in some sense going to be the intellectual leaders of China's future. But what you've written about, can China lead, will China lead? Certainly China is so much more important today in the world than it was when we began to study China. What's your view of we've talked about the past, what's your view of things going forward?
Well, I think the future of China is extraordinarily bright. China 20, 30, 40, 50 years from now will be richer, stronger economically, stronger militarily, more influential internationally. I have absolutely no doubt about China's future and its prospects for prosperity and success. The leadership that has defined China in both moral and intellectual terms over the long durée of Chinese history that we've studied in this course, that, however, will depend on leadership in the world of ideas and the world of what it means to be civilized. Right now, China has recovered extraordinarily over the last century and a half from a very low point in the middle of the 19th century, in part because of extraordinarily adept use of international ideas. put into Chinese circumstances, powerful ideas that define the nature of the Chinese state today. And yet there are many ideas in China's past that one actually needs to know about.
That's right.
Needs to be educated about to see if there are recoverable areas of Chinese civilization that can serve one of the great powers of the 21st century.
From my perspective, I think that's unquestioned truth, that there are those ideas, there are those values, there's a literary tradition, people write poetry, they can paint. There's what's going to make China part of an extraordinary part of a globalized world, a world where we recognize many different cultures that interact with each other, is its amalgam of the best from all over with the best of its own past. And
yes.
Come back next year when we begin China 2.0, China X 2.0, and we'll be ready to show you some of those new ideas, those new faces, and we're going to introduce you to a lot more of China X.
But before we leave finally, if you've learned nothing else in this course, and it's quite possible you've learned nothing else in this course, we hope you will have learned the names of the major dynasties. And so let us close with another iteration of our...
You're not going to really?
Absolutely.
Oh my.
Shangzhou Qin Han, Shangzhou Qin Han, Sui Tang Song, Sui Tang Song, Yuan Mingqing Republic, Yuan Mingqing Republic, Mao Zedong, Mao Zedong.
Thanks a lot.
Bye-bye.